there has always been that perception of bias, and not just in basketball, but in native rodeo, which is also an important sport, also in football and native baseball. There used to be a lot more native athletes in baseball as well. It was pretty commonly understood that non-native officials would be biased against native athletes. By understood, I should say perceived. So I tried to look into that and try to figure out if there was any way to prove that objectively. And so I just looked at scores and scores, well, like about 150 box scores from different games of native teams playing non-native teams, just to see if there was lopsided fouling. And interestingly, it was remarkably consistent, actually, pretty even, the number of fouls called in native and non-native teams. Right. But that doesn't mean that it was fair, because that just means how many fouls are called. It doesn't mean how many aren't called that might have been committed. You know, like if one team's fouling way more often, but you get an even number of fouls, then it's actually not fair, right? So I wasn't able to definitively prove anything that way, but definitely it's not a new idea that they'd be biased. It's also true in the early 20th century that pretty much everybody assumed that officials were biased, not necessarily just racially, but for home teams, because it used to be that the home team would hire the officials. Early 20th century, they'd be mostly white, but if a game was played at a boarding school, for example, then the boarding school would acquire the coach. The referees. They would still usually be white, but whether they would be more likely to be biased against the team that hired them, I don't know. Early on, the officials were often the coaches and faculty from those schools. They didn't have people that were set officials. Later on, they started to have people that were full-on referees, and then, as I said, whichever team was home would hire those people. Most of the stuff that I was looking at for that earlier era, I'm relying on often newspaper reporting and things like that, which are usually silent about that. So it's, for me to say that I don't have a lot of examples of that doesn't mean it wasn't common. Occasionally in reporting from like the 20s or 30s, if things got very out of hand and violent, then you'll get a sense of that from the reporting. But in terms of people yelling racial slurs and things like that, there's enough evidence from them that it's pretty clear it was common. For instance, the boarding schools had their own newspapers usually, and although obviously there's biases in those papers, that the messages that are sent through those papers were controlled by the institution, and non-natives usually running those institutions. Even so, a lot of times in those school newspapers, they're reporting on officials being biased. They wouldn't have labeled it in those reports as racial, but they still would label it as they're biased against Haskell or they're biased against Carlisle. There's also some newspaper reporting from the time talking about how a certain game seemed that the referees were biased, especially against Carlisle. That was common, even to the point that sometimes white spectators were getting upset about the way it was being called against Carlisle. So there's enough hints that you'll pick up here and there. Also, in talking to people that were in their 70s or 80s, who I was talking to over the last 10, 20 years, they clearly believed that when they were young, it was that what people think now, they thought then. And also, as I said, other scholars that have written about, for instance, the history of rodeo, history of native baseball, native football, that's a common theme in all those books, that officiating bias was perceived as a serious problem. And there were occasionally teams, that would commonly have foul trouble, and other teams that wouldn't. But why would it be that? There's different possibilities. One is that it wasn't biased. you know. Two is that playing the different styles that they were playing, maybe native teams fouled less often, but got called, you know, at a higher rate, so it evened out. One possibility is also, if officiating was biased, that relying more on speed and agility and shooting from the outside might also have been a way to try to compensate for the fact that fouls were going to be called on you more often if you're in close.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, because the way most non-native teams played tended to be a more physical game, where weight would be a more important factor than your height even. Students in those schools were coming from many different indigenous traditions, you know, the different languages, different forms of governance traditionally, different oral traditions, but one thing that's fairly common traditionally in many indigenous communities, native communities, is a running tradition. That running not only for necessity, for economic necessity, but running for ceremonial purposes and for other purposes, and especially distance running. And so part of it is that many of those students in those schools were already runners, and they're channeling that into basketball as they're learning that game. But also they're in a boarding school environment where they're with their teammates. They have no choice but to be with their teammates around the clock every day of the week. And basketball, as I said, became something that not that there was never anything negative about it, and not that it didn't have its darker aspects, but for the most part, students gravitated it as a way, kind of as an escape from the environment. Sometimes literally, because they could get out to travel and play, but also an escape within those campuses. And they played it so often that they developed some abilities at teamwork that non-native teams couldn't match them. I think it's kind of a combination of certain traditional sporting traditions that are being funneled through this new activity, and also that those schools were kind of an intensive environment where they could become very good at doing the things that they gravitated to. Besides the fact that referees at certain times in history may indeed have be biased against native athletes, I think it also would just be something that would very much stand out for you, because it is, just like you're saying, it's an area where you do have more control as an individual and as a group with your peers, where you're free, you're more freely able to move your body about, to express yourself in ways that you couldn't in a very strict classroom environment or a strict work environment or many of the other environments that those students had to deal with. And then to have somebody come in and interfere with that would be an even more pronounced thing. Especially then, reffing was just something that, as I said, that the opposing coaches would serve as the refs, or the school chaperones that brought the team there would serve as the officials. So, and for a while what they used to do is that each team would provide, so you'd have the referees and you have the umpire, and the home team would provide one and the away team would provide the other, so they tried to balance it out that way. But it was very common for people in general to assume that officiating was biased, because even Naismith in his memoirs complained that was a problem that couldn't be solved, is how to get truly, objective referees. So it and it is also true, of course, that it isn't necessarily just native people that think that officials would be biased for one reason or another, but it was definitely a very strong perception, and always has been. I mean, it's beyond just the fact of home team bias or something like that it'd be racial.
And were those refs, if they would be from the other teams, would they be paid, or was it more of a...
Initially, no, and then eventually they would be paid by the home institution that's hosting the game, in which case then there might still be allegation that it would be biased. And another thing, of course, is that what a foul is now isn't necessarily what a foul was in 1920. The rules change so much over time, and the way the game plays so much over time. If you perceive that a referee is biased against you, or if they are biased against you, not only does it shatter that sense of freedom that you're getting, that you might not be getting elsewhere, but that the whole point of sports is supposed to be that and this is how people talk about them, that it's a level playing field. You know, that anywhere else that students in that era would go in their daily, or just people in general at that time, it wasn't a level playing field. You know, in terms of dealing with the law or a society or citizenship rights or what have you. Sports, the beauty of it is that it was that exception. Right? That, I mean, the rules are the same, the court's the same, the ball's the same, everything's the same. The only thing that can ruin that is officiating.